have this portion of the study through the book of Joshua that we would go through several chapters in one setting. And so we're covering about 9 chapters. Now there's a portion of chapters 14 and 15 that is not going to be, we're not going to talk about tonight, because it covers the story of Caleb and his family. We'll make that a second lesson. But for the lesson this evening, let me back up again. We have the final portion of the division of the land that God had promised to the people. Here in this first chapter, we see right off that God kept His word. He said that He would give them the whole land, and He did that. This record of the distribution of the land was of great importance to the people of Israel, because of a portion of the old law in Numbers chapter 36 and verse 9, where the old law, the Mosaic law, said, no inheritance shall change hands from one tribe to another, but every tribe of the children of Israel shall keep its own inheritance. If you'll recall the story of Naboth and the vineyard that King Ahab coveted, that he wanted, he tried to buy it, he tried to trade for it, and Naboth wouldn't do it, because it was given to him, to his family, in their portion, in their allotment, and it was literally against the law for him then to sell it or to trade it in any way. All of this illustrates how God kept His word to the Israelites. God speaks again to Joshua and says, basically He says, Joshua, you're an old man and you're about to die. And it's time to get on with distributing the land. It's time to get on with dividing the land according to the tribes. There's still a lot of work to do. Don't rest. Don't take it easy. Get moving. So we learn lessons from this as well as from other portions of the book of Joshua. And this one teaches us that there's still work to do. Regardless of the years that we're blessed with to live on this earth, we still have work to do. Joshua's work was to preside over the distribution of the land for the nation. He was to employ what is called the lot in assigning the tribal areas. He was not to divide the land by his own ingenuity or by his own genius. And you could classify what we know of Joshua as, classify him as a genius, though he was very wise and he was just and he was very experienced. God said, use the lot to divide the land. This way, literally deferred the whole matter into the hand of the Almighty. It was all put into God's hands, the division. And the division that they received was to be an inheritance among the people. Then the people were to go and they were to possess the land. Now we've covered up to this point some of the great battles, how Joshua and the armies of Israel discomfited the armies of some vast armies, some huge armies of the Canaanites. But there were still small towns and small villages where some escaped and were harboring. And it was these tribes' job then, after their allotment was given to them, to go and drive them out. And we'll talk about that later on in the lesson. The people were to go and possess the land. That's what I'm trying to say here. God said that He would drive out the inhabitants as the people went in and possessed the land. As they went in and took the land, God said He would drive them out. But He warned them that if they became comfortable and content with what they had, with their enemies living close by, with perhaps even their enemies living in their own cities and in their own tribal states, if you will, God said He would not drive them out. In chapter 13, we have noticed the parts of the Transjordan territory. That is the place where the tribes of Reuben and Manasseh and Gad had decided that as they were shepherds and ranchers, people with livestock, that was their business, they wanted to settle on the other side of Jordan, close to, and they were under oath, of course, to go in and help their brethren defeat the enemies. We notice that parts of this had not yet fallen into the hands of God's people. Parts of this country had not yet become under subjection to God's people. This was, if you will, the far-flung corners of the promised land. All the people had not had time to conquer every corner of the promised land. We have, of course, a very detailed account of the inheritances of those 2.5 tribes on the Jordan side, or on the side of Jordan that was west of Jordan, east of Jordan. There are very few reasons. There are a few reasons why we have a detailed account like this. And even though much of the reading that we're covering tonight, I'm not actually going to read it, I'm going to refer to it, reads much like a contract or a very legal document, because that's really what it was. Part of the reasons why God inspired this to be recorded was to impress on the descendants of this people, of this generation, the goodness of God to their ancestors, so that their children and their grandchildren, their offspring, would be able to look back and see how good God had been to his people. And it served to prevent territorial disputes among God's people. This detailed account of the various tribal allotments was literally a record of the boundaries of each tribe. It served too to impress upon Joshua that the distribution of the land must be done in a very precise and exact manner. And of course, at the very last, and we'll cover that at the very end of the lesson, we have the inheritance of Levi. Levi was to receive a very special type of inheritance. Twice in this chapter, we read that Moses gave no inheritance to the land, to the tribe of Levi. They didn't receive any land per se. We learn why later in the book. In chapter 14, this is, for sake of lack of a better term, what I call a record of the council of leadership. Joshua had a council of elders, the leaders of each individual tribe, and Eleazar, the high priest, to assist him in this division of land. And of course, this was of the 10 tribes of the people of Israel. The 2, Reuben and Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh were not included in this part. After literally 7 years of fighting, it was time to parcel out the land, and this is what we're talking about tonight. Joshua had acted under directives from the Lord and a previous agreement with the tribes on the eastern side of Jordan. Joshua also honored allotments given to Caleb by Moses in this chapter, which we'll come back and talk about next time we study the book of Joshua. In chapter 15, we see that Joshua's work had eliminated any threat of united opposition. So the land can now be assigned to the tribes and it can be occupied. There was going to be some opposition. There was going to be some skirmishes, some, you might call them minor battles, individual fights maybe. But this idea of a king of a city who was leading the area, who was the king of the leading city in the area, calling to and forming a coalition like we read about in chapter 12, it just wasn't going to happen because they had been so utterly destroyed at this time. Caleb, of course, led the way by taking Hebron. He led the way. He served as an example again for the people of Israel. The first tribe that was to receive the allotment was the tribe of Judah. Judah and Joseph were the 2 sons of Jacob, on whom Reuben's forfeited inheritance or forfeited birthright fell. Judah was given dominion over his brothers, and Joseph was given the double portion that normally went to the firstborn. Remember that the firstborn son was to take the place of the father when the father died, and that he was to receive a double portion of the inheritance. Whatever the father had was to be divided among his sons only the firstborn was to receive 2 portions, not just his own, not just the first one. Joseph was given the double portion. Judah was the leader of the people of Israel. Joshua was taken from the tribe of Joseph. We find that that's interesting. And Caleb, of course, was from the tribe of Judah. So these 2 men were in keeping with their forefathers and with their ancestors. We learn more about Caleb and his illustrious family in this chapter, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. The city list. This is the list of the cities that fell in the lot and the allotment to Judah. Quite an impressive list, really. And Judah, in their conquering and in the process of possessing the land that was given to them, actually took several years. Some of the cities we'll read about as we continue through the study of the books of history went back and forth between the Canaanites and the Israelites as to who was in control of them. In all, there was about 90 cities listed in the lot to Judah. Likely these are grouped together because of their proximity. One man counted 100 and something. But there are some interesting things of note. Some interesting cities of note, if you will. Bethlehem, of course, became the city of David. Became a very important town. Bethlehem is also the place where the Lord was born. It's not listed in this passage. It either was so small that it was of no importance whatsoever at the time, or it simply didn't exist. We're just simply not sure. First of all, these territories that Judah was not able to, we see, first of all, in these territories that Judah was not able to drive out all of the inhabitants. I want to say that it's not that they weren't able, but that they weren't willing. Particularly Jerusalem. Jerusalem was possessed and controlled, manned, governed by the Jebusites until David's time, when David actually led and conquered the city of Jerusalem. Had the people of Judah acted with vigor, I believe that God would have given them much success. We see this over and over, and it's going to be a repeated story, repeated line throughout the history of the people of Israel. Jerusalem was not taken till the time of David. Other notable cities were Libnah. Libnah is the city that rebelled in King Joram's days and appears to have set up, at least for a time, an independent state. We'll read about that in 2 Kings chapter 8 and verse 22. Lachish, we hear about Lachish. King Amaziah was slain there. This city led the plunge into idolatry in the book of Judges. And Micah records this in Micah chapter 1 and verse 13. Gilo was the city of Ahithophel, which was a cohort with David and some of his work. Tekoa was the city that the prophet Amos was from. Mareshah was where King Asa, was the city that King Asa conquered. Adullam, Ziph, Kaliah, Moan, and Gadi, and Ziklag were cities in this allotment that gave King David much trouble during his reign and during his time as a leader in the people of Israel. Now moving on to chapter 16. Joseph, this is the record of the allotment for Joseph. Joseph was one of the younger sons of Jacob. He was the firstborn